Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the fourth Praxis Roundtable, hosted by the World Bank here in Sydney in partnership with The Diplomat magazine. My name's Ian Gerard and I'm editor of The Diplomat. I'd like to extend a special welcome to everyone watching at home on APAC or over the internet or listening on radio across the Asia Pacific. Last month we discussed climate change, and today, following on pretty much directly from that, we're looking at energy. On the panel are Tendai Gregan, who's an energy specialist for the World Bank's Pacific Department, Mark Diesendorf, over on the left, who is Deputy Director for the Institute of Environmental Studies at the University of New South Wales. And in the middle we have Jack Whelan, who is Chief Operating Officer at Environment Business Australia and Head of Private Sector Engagement with the Foundation for Development Cooperation. When the United Nations adopted its 8 Millennium Development Goals in 2000, top of the list was the desire to eradicate extreme poverty and hunger. More specifically, a goal was set to halve the proportion of people living on less than $1 a day by 2015. However, according to World Energy Outlook, that target is, quote, very unlikely to be met, because it would need to be accompanied by a reduction in the number of people without electricity from the current 1.6 billion to 1 billion. Of those 1.6 billion, the Foundation for Development Cooperation estimates 1 billion live in the Asia Pacific and says that without access to modern energy, the poorest in the Asia-Pacific region are deprived of opportunities for economic and social development. Environmental degradation is exacerbated as a result. There is growing awareness of the need and potential for cleaner, more renewable energy to provide an environmentally sustainable and cost-effective means of supplying off-grid access to energy for the poor, particularly in developing countries. World energy demand is expected to grow by around 55% up to 2030. With 70% of that increase coming in developing countries and nearly 50% of it due to electricity generation. Because fossil fuels are expected to remain the dominant source of energy in that time, a 62% increase in carbon dioxide emissions is expected. Developed countries, including of course Australia, are increasingly committing themselves to carbon capture and storage as a means of tackling this, in line with the Garnaut report's finding that the future for coal-based electricity generation, for coal exports and for mitigation in developing Asia depends on carbon capture and storage becoming commercially effective. However, doubts remain about CCS, including concerns over cost, safety, transportation, water usage, and the suggestion that too much emphasis is being placed on CCS at the expense of renewable energy. And then, of course, there is also the issue of practicality, particularly in our region, in the Asia Pacific. AusAid has pointed out that in rural and remote areas, transmission and distribution of energy generated from fossil fuels can be difficult and expensive, while producing renewable energy locally can offer a viable alternative. It has also been argued that renewable energy can directly contribute to poverty alleviation by providing the energy needed for creating business and employment. Those are just some of the issues that our panellists may like to address today, and once we've heard from each of them, I'm going to invite questions from the room, which is your opportunity to add your thoughts and ideas to the debate. Our first speaker today is Dr. Mark Diesendorf. Mark is the Deputy Director for the Institute of Environmental Studies at the University of New South Wales. He has also been a Principal Research Scientist at the CSIRO and Professor of Environmental Science at the University of Technology, Sydney. He is the author of Greenhouse Solutions with Sustainable Energy, right here for you, and the forthcoming Climate Action, a campaign manual for greenhouse solutions, which isn't back from the printers yet. So over to you, Mark.
Well, thank you very much, Ian. And I enjoy travelling very much in the Asian region, and when I do, I really see two worlds in the so-called developing world. There's the village world, which is really the majority of people still, and then there's the urban world, which seems to be trying to follow in the Western development model. And I'll just like to comment very briefly about both worlds and the role of renewable energy in both those worlds. In the village world, it seems, although there's big variations from Asia to the Pacific and from country to country, the main energy uses generally are for cooking and for lighting and irrigation and running farm machinery. And it's an entirely different world from the urban industrialised world. Many villages are totally unsuited for connecting to the grid. I've travelled quite a bit in Bangladesh, and much of the ground is covered with water for large parts of the year. It's not an area that lends itself to a national electricity grid spanning all the villages, but there is huge potential for renewable sources of energy at the village level, at the local level. Renewable energy sources vary from country to country, from region to region, but certainly for solar energy, there's large potential. There is some wind power potential in particular areas. Microhydro, again, in areas that are not flat and almost below sea level. Biomass energy in the Pacific from coconut oil, for example, there's potential there, although coconut oil probably has much higher value for other products like soaps and face oils and so on. So there is a lot of potential. There are also some barriers that have to be overcome. There are subsidies to fossil fuels so that it's easier in many places to install a petrol generator or a diesel generator, which gets enormous subsidies rather than a renewable energy system, a solar system. There are problems in that many of the technologies aren't properly certified. Many countries don't have good consumer laws. And I must add that even in Australia, although solar electric systems are certified, the implementation and enforcement of that certification isn't very good. And so there are some systems coming into the country which are actually potentially dangerous. Now I'd like to shift to the urban developing country scene, where we are talking about industry, we're talking about commerce, we're talking about the electricity grid, heating and cooling, and mass transport. And in this world, in many ways, it's very similar to the Western world in terms of energy consumption. I have a particular interest in China, and China, as you know, is now the world's biggest greenhouse gas emitter, recently overtaking the United States. But Australia also has its own record to be ashamed of, which is that we are the world's biggest per capita emitter of greenhouse gases of all the industrialised countries. And I think in the context of talking about energy, we have to talk about greenhouse, which was the subject of a previous Praxis workshop. I think we've reached the stage now where we have to be finding ways to stop building conventional coal-fired power stations. We can't really tolerate them, neither in Australia, nor the United States, nor in China or India. And yet all those countries have quite a large dependence on coal for generating power, particularly Australia and China. But I think we're coming to the end of the age of coal until we can see the mythical carbon capture and storage coming online, and that's not going to happen soon. So I believe that the Western countries have to set an example. If China and India and other rapidly developing countries are to move off the pathway to stop making the same mistakes that our countries have made, then we have to set an example. We have to start that transition to renewable sources of energy used efficiently, because this planet certainly cannot sustain everyone living at the same level of wastage as in Australia or the United States. Now, fortunately, there is a way forward in that area, and I believe it is a sustainable energy pathway that, in my book, I've argued Australia could make a transition to 100% renewable energy within a few decades, given the political will. A renewable energy electricity system could be just as reliable as a conventional fossil fuel system. It won't be all wind power, it won't be all solar, it'll be a mix of different sources, solar, wind, geothermal, biomass, and together they can provide a system that's just as reliable as the conventional dirty systems that we need to move away from. So there is a way forward. In China, China is actually one of the world's leading countries in a number of renewable energy areas. For the last 4 years, it has doubled its wind power capacity every year, an extraordinary rate of growth. It is now has the fourth highest wind power capacity in the world, probably the third highest next year. It is the world's biggest producer and consumer of solar hot water systems. It is the world's biggest producer of solar electric systems, having overtaken Japan last year, although most of its systems are still for export. It has a lot of geothermal potential, that's hot earth potential, although so far mostly it's just using that for heat rather than electricity supply. And of course it is using a lot of hydro already, but I believe that as global warming continues, we will see continued melting of the glaciers in Tibet, and unfortunately rivers like the Yangtze and the Yellow River will really dry up completely after a few years of floods. So there is a way forward, but we really have to start now for both the developing countries and the overdeveloped countries. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Mark. We're going to hear now from Jack Whelan, who has recently returned to Australia after spending 20 years working in environmental policy advocacy for leading international business organisations. Jack is currently multitasking as Chief Operating Officer at Environment Business Australia, which is a coalition of companies representing the interests of the environment industry and clean tech sector, and he's also Head of Private Sector Engagement with the Foundation for Development Cooperation. Jack.
Thank you very much, and also thank you, Mark, because a lot of what I'm about to say is trying to suggest some ways in which we can make what Mark's been talking about, make them actually happen. But firstly, just briefly to let you know what the Foundation for Development Cooperation does. It's an Australian organisation, but it's almost entirely focused on activities in Asia and the Pacific. It's an international, independent, not-for-profit development organisation, which was founded in Brisbane in 1990. And its mandate is to develop alliances and partnerships and to undertake a range of initiatives which seek to improve the lives of the poor in developing countries. A couple of examples of the sorts of things that it's really built its reputation on. One is that it's been very active in stimulating the development and initiation of microfinance institutions right across the region. And for example, it performs the secretariat role for two microfinance networks, one called Banking with the Poor Network, which is mainly covers Asia, and another called Microfinance Pacifica Network, which of course covers the Pacific. But today what I want to talk to you about is an initiative that FDC has been working on for a little while to establish a thing called the Energy for All Partnership, which has been supported very strongly from the Asian Development Bank and many other organisations and donor organisations and the private sector right across the region. And this builds very much on what Ian said in his introduction, where we've all become very much aware of the challenge of the provision of cleaner and more renewable energy to provide environmentally sustainable and cost-effective means of supplying off-grid access, primarily, as Mark was talking about, in developing countries across the region. And as Ian said, there's no specific MDG goal, MDG for energy, but it's clear that widespread lack of access among the poor acts as a very severe impediment to progress in meeting most of those MDGs. And also, it's essential to achieve significant improvements in indoor air pollution, infant and maternal health, education, agriculture, and the eradication of hunger. We actually heard a lot more about this last week. Both Tendai and I were attending the Pacific Energy Ministers meeting in Tonga last week, where really this came very strongly across, that this chronic lack of access to cleaner and more sustainable energy supplies also has major implications for economic growth by placing significant restraints on the productive capacity of micro-entrepreneurs and rural supply chains. And it's increasingly apparent that continued use of wood and kerosene, traditional biomass for cooking and heating and lighting, is increasing the contribution of poorer communities to greenhouse gas emissions. And indeed, we now recognise that in the Asia-Pacific region alone, there are still nearly 1 billion people without access to electricity and 1.8 billion people who rely on biomass and traditional sources of energy for cooking and heating. So what did we do to try and address this? Well, as I said, we've formed an Energy for All partnership and to respond to some of these challenges. And this is really aimed at introducing modern, sustainable grid and off-grid energy services to at least 100 million additional people in the region within 5 years. And so the goal of this partnership is to scale up energy services that are safe, clean, affordable, and easily accessible. We're not looking for totally new projects or new initiatives. We want to identify those that have already proven some degree of success and have reached a level whereby something extra is needed to bring them to scale. So we want to do this by stimulating cooperation among donors and governments and civil society and the private sector, very importantly, the private sector across the Asia-Pacific region. We want to do this by coordinating effective learning and information sharing, networking and mentoring, and also to advocate new approaches and methodologies, identifying new and innovative financing sources and mobilising resources and additional support. We also want to see, as has already been said, that there are significant opportunities for energy efficiency, which we saw, again, some examples of this when we were in some of the islands in the South Pacific. So the emphasis of the Energy for All partnership should focus less on the technologies, the specific technologies that are available, because really, as we've already heard, those technologies are there, they're available. They may not yet be affordable, but they're certainly available, and that we've got to find ways of improving and implementing financing models that bring them to be accessible and affordable at the village level across the region. So the Asian Development Bank was very keen also to identify ways in which they can, of course, as a large multilateral donor organisation and development organisation, many of their projects and loans are focused at extremely large projects, and they also have identified that there are many applications for these technologies right down to very local and village level. But the challenge is, how do you actually improve the flow of financing to make these projects happen? So a number of different organisations have got together, many of them with very strong expertise within the region. These are groups like GVEP, International Global Village Energy Partnership, the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, which is very keen to bring in as many private sector interests as possible. REAP, which is the Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency Partnership, which is a global partnership, but which has a significant Asia and Southeast Asia and Pacific operation, which is based here in the Secretariat for which is based here in Australia. UNDP is another one, SNV, E&Co, Green Microfinance. There are many of these organisations. They all have pilot projects operating throughout the region. But as we said, the interests of the Foundation for Development Cooperation and the Asian Development Bank is to work together with all these different partners, and particularly to identify additional sources of financing and indeed other sources of business operation or other methodologies to bring some of these technologies to an affordable place. And indeed, using some of our expertise and in the microfinance area, I think there's increasing opportunities to find ways of implementing or adapting microfinance models to see whether they can be applied to stimulate and scale up this access to modern and affordable energy. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Jack. Finally, I'd like to introduce Tendai Gregan. Tendai, as I said at the start, is an energy specialist for the World Bank's Pacific Department. And before that, he was a senior advisor at the Australian Energy Market Commission, which sets the market rules and regulatory framework for Australia's electricity and gas industries. Tendai's experience includes reviewing greenhouse gas abatement programs, estimating the economy-wide effects of increasing Australia's greenhouse gas abatement target, wholesale energy market design, power asset valuations, and the rebalancing of electricity tariffs. And today, Tendai will be discussing the World Bank's work on energy in the Pacific region. Tendai.
Thanks, Ian. I'll just talk about the range of countries in which the bank's working in the Pacific and the key energy sector issues that those countries face and the types of work that the bank's doing there. The countries in which the bank's operating in across the Pacific range from Kiribati in the northern Pacific, across to Palau, Marshall Islands, and then moving into the South Pacific, we have places like Fiji, Tonga, Papua New Guinea, Vanuatu, and we also have some work in East Timor. The key sort of sectoral issues that are faced there really come down to there's access to energy is quite limited in a number of the countries. There's a high cost of providing the energy services there, and oftentimes they get quite poor quality services. And that's due in part to the very high reliance on fossil fuels, particularly liquid petroleum, to provide electricity services. And the other thing that contributes to that is some inefficient power utilities, which makes it adds to the cost. The other sort of challenge that is faced by a lot of these countries in the Pacific is there's a lack of planning and strategy and limited capacity within the countries to implement some major changes that are required. And one of the other things that we're working on is really trying to improve donor coordination to harness and make best use of the funds, the limited funds that are available there, and go beyond some of the pilot projects that have been put in place before. In terms of, to give you an idea of some of the issues that are faced within the Pacific, I'll touch on a few facts. Most of the countries, imported oil accounts for more than 90% of the primary energy for the generation of electricity, and oftentimes oil is the largest import. It makes up a sizable proportion of total imports. The cost of that is really substantial in terms of what people pay for their electricity. The average sort of retail tariff that people pay is around US 10 cents a kilowatt hour and going up towards US 30 cents a kilowatt hour. Compare that to Australia, where we pay around about anywhere between about 8 to 10 cents US a kilowatt hour. So significantly higher costs than in Australia. Last year, when we had the really high oil prices in a place like the Solomon Islands, the price was around US 52 cents a kilowatt hour, which is really unaffordable given the income level in those countries. The other thing is access to electricity in these countries is quite limited. In Papua New Guinea, less than 10% of the population will say have access to electricity. They'll be reliant on kerosene lamps and other things, fuel for lighting and energy. Whereas in other countries like in Samoa, you'll end up with over 90% or around 90% of people have access to electricity. The average across the Pacific is around about 50%. In terms of the cost of making a substantial difference to that, it's been estimated, excluding Papua New Guinea, you could probably provide basic lighting services across the Pacific for less than the cost of a large jet plane. So it's not a lot of money, but it can have a big difference. In terms of the bank's been involved in energy in the Pacific for many decades. It financed some of the power stations, hydropower stations that light up Port Moresby back in the 60s before it got its independence. It's also been providing energy advice since then across the Pacific. Today's portfolio in the bank really looks at a number of key themes. It's energy access, trying to improve energy efficiency, increasing the use of renewable energy in these countries at the village level, off-grid, as well as on-grid. Importantly, one of the things the bank's trying to do is reduce the fiscal and economic impacts arising from the dependency of these countries on imported oil, particularly their vulnerability to volatility in that oil price. And finally, the other sort of theme of the type of work the bank's doing is trying to improve the regulatory and investment environment. I'll give you an example of the types of, one of the types of projects we have, and it links in with what Jack was talking about financing. We have a project which is multi-regional, multi-country, that is trying to look at providing financing to people to put in place things like solar PV, pico hydro, really small scale hydro, and switching to biofuels such as coconut oil, as well as enhanced energy efficiency. And that's a project that operates in Solomon Islands, Fiji, Vanuatu and the Marshall Islands. Is where we're trying to roll that out in. Importantly, what it's trying to do is have build scale in production of operations, build expertise, and have something that is financially and economically and environmentally sustainable. That's the type of model that we're looking at in the projects. An example of how that can have an effect on a particular community in the Pacific is, I'll give you an example from Vanuatu, which is where we had coconut oil production in a place called Port Albury. This was not funded by the bank, this was by another donor, and that was tied to income generation activities. So this allowed a communal freezer to be set up. That allows people there to freeze or chill their fish. They can then sell that fish at a much higher price at the fresh fish in the main market rather than having to dry it. And so that's designed to have an economic impact rather than just have basic lighting services. So they're the types of things that we're trying to look at. We're trying to upscale that in terms of a wider project, which we're in the planning stages of developing, and that's called Energising the Pacific. And we're looking to build into that some of the features in terms of on-grid, off-grid, improved efficiency, as well as increased use of renewable energy.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Tendai. We've heard from all our panellists. It's now time to open up for questions from the audience. As I said, if you can wait until the microphone comes around to you and then stand and give your name and where you're from, and then we can take it from there. Got a question down at the front, please.
My name is Andrea Ottina. I'm from the CPAC, Center for Peace and Conflict Studies at the University of Sydney. And I have a question for Tendai. You said that 10% of the population has electricity right now in Papua New Guinea, and you say that there are projects for a fiscal relief on oil import and these kind of things. But my question is, do they actually need electricity in Papua New Guinea? How do you measure the demand of this electricity? Like, you go to ask village by village, like, do you actually need electricity? Like, that's the thing, like, how do you actually measure the need for electricity in the country, especially in a country like Papua New Guinea?
Okay, in Papua New Guinea, it's actually less than 10% of the population have access to energy. Outside of the capital and the main towns and some of what they call C centres there, which are old government centres, most people, for basic lighting, they're relying on kerosene. Now, that is quite intermittent in supply. It has to be, a lot of the times it has to be flown into remote villages. People need lighting at night for basic sort of doing things, services. It also affects education services in terms of people being able to study. The cost and intermittency of the supply of fuel makes it difficult and expensive for people. In terms of how you go about measuring that, we've done surveys, and we're able to estimate roughly what's required for a basic household needs, and then you can build on from that. So there are ways of doing that, and that goes into the planning process.
Well, just to add to that, I think the kerosene also has a number of disadvantages. Of course, its major advantage is that it's easy to break it down into very small units. So it becomes affordable, even though per unit of calorific value, it's actually quite expensive compared to some other alternatives. And so I think again the challenge is how do we find ways of identifying other sources of energy, not necessarily electricity. You're absolutely right, but other sources of energy which can equally be broken down into small daily doses, if you like. That may be LP gas, for instance. Now, of course, it's difficult to get a distribution network for LP gas and the cylinders returned and refilled in a country like Papua New Guinea outside the main population centres. But that's the kind of principle that we're really looking for, is how do you find a way of bringing energy down into daily dose, affordable packets.
Great. I'll just see if we've got any more questions from the floor.
My name's Frank Hutchinson. I'm from the University of Sydney. I'm attached to the Centre for Peace and Conflict Studies. I would like to thank the panellists for the overview that they've given. It seems to me, though, that you're raising some really critical questions about energy futures. And I think that whilst to an extent each panellist has touched on some important elements, I think there are some, if you like, elephants in the room. One of the elephants in the room, and this is something I'd like you to respond to, is that often we talk about, for example, clean tech. And in terms of clean tech, we're offered a suite of technologies. Some of those include renewables, but they also increasingly include things like nuclear power. There are issues around that, and I'd like the panel to actually address those, because we're talking about the needs of the poor in the world, and that's another elephant in the room, if you like. How do we actually address some of the critical issues of the disparities in wealth and energy use within the world, and how do we actually relate that to questions of intergenerational equity? So how do we actually come up, if you like, with approaches that enable a better world to emerge? What kind of energy future do each of the panellists see? Mark has actually, as I understand it, charted out some of the ideas for this, and he lays down a challenge, but I'd like to hear a little bit more about this, because I think that often when we look at these problems, we actually see it as a problem of the third world or the developing world, rather than a problem that is very much centred here in affluent societies. So I'd like a response from the panel to those sorts of complex questions, but I think they're important questions in terms of the ways in which we may move forward to a better future for all of us. Thank you.
Mark, did you want to respond first to that?
Well, first I'd agree, Frank, that the problem of development or the problem of poverty is not just a problem of the poor, it's a problem of the rich, that we are taking a very large percentage of the world's resources, and it's just simply not possible for everyone to live on this planet, the current lifestyle of Australia or the United States. And that means that there has to be changes in Australia and the United States, as well as in the less developed countries. And so that means really an energy revolution amongst other kinds of revolutions. In terms of nuclear power, we're talking about a technology that makes a very small contribution in most developing countries. It's only suitable for large grids. China, until recently, generated 2.3% of its electricity from nuclear, but Tendai is telling me that there's been quite a lot installed in the last year or two. But even then, it's a very small part of China's energy system. Most of it is coal. The renewable energy target for China is to go from its current level of about 8% renewables, mostly hydro, up to 15 or 16% by 2020. And they have a very major renewables program. Nuclear power is a very slow technology to grow, to build nuclear power stations. And so I don't really see it as making a significant contribution in the next 10 or 15 years in the Asia-Pacific region, really at all, any additional contribution. I'd also point out that in the longer term, it's not really accurate to call it a clean technology, because the carbon dioxide emissions from the nuclear fuel cycle will increase as we run out of high-grade uranium. At present, we only have very small reserves of high-grade uranium, and so the fossil fuels used to mine and mill it give fairly small greenhouse gas emissions. But within a few decades, even with the existing nuclear power, we'll see nuclear power being somewhere in the middle between coal and renewable sources as a carbon dioxide emitter, because of the need to mine and chop up large quantities of rock to mill the uranium. So that's my take on the issue.
Jack, you got anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, you raise, of course, all these extremely large issues, which I know was a subject of an earlier presentation in this series when Paul Gilding, went into quite a lot of detail about both Australia and other international responsibilities for identifying opportunities in the whole area of energy and climate change and development. My other hat I wear is with Environment Business Australia, which is obviously very interested to ensure that countries like Australia demonstrate a position of leadership internationally, and also really to acknowledge that we've got to start accounting for the real cost of a dependence on fossil fuels, and real cost meaning in real environmental cost, and to start really finding ways, which Australia and other countries are now doing, and China and many others focusing on energy efficiency and other alternative renewable energy type technologies. But I think for the purpose of this discussion, really, I was very much trying to emphasize how some of these technologies might be developed that are appropriate for very small communities in developing countries in Asia and the Pacific. Many of them are island communities where, as Tendai said, have become very dependent on imported oil. So quite apart from all the other climate change or environmental issues in that, it's, as last year demonstrated, there was a considerable oil price shock where some of those island communities just became completely unsustainable in their energy use because they were not able to afford the extremely high cost of imported oil. And so I think, you know, my real issue here is to be rather technology agnostic, but to find ways of which, for example, we visited a very small island just off Tonga where there was a restaurant and a small tourism business, and we asked them how did they generate their electricity. They're clearly not on a grid, and they said, oh, we have a generator. And we said, that's great. Well, what is the fuel? And they said, well, it's petrol. We said, petrol? That's interesting. Well, how many litres of petrol do you use every day? 20 litres of petrol. What's the cost? Extremely expensive. Now, I can imagine that they're beginning to get to the point when they're thinking, well, they could make some real economies by switching perhaps to a diesel generator. On the other hand, that could be a mistake. And so we were thinking of, well, how could we make it so that solar technology, which was really their next best option, might be affordable in that island sense. And so this is where I think a lot of the discussions that we had, and I know Tendai and I were very much focusing on how to find financing options that allow small communities like that to identify solutions which are immediate solutions for them, quite apart from the broader global challenges.
Do we have another question, please? Yes, please.
Thank you. Kirk Huffman, I'm a research associate at the Australian Museum and honorary curator of the Vanuatu Culture Centre and on the scientific committee of the museum in Tahiti. Most of my work has been based in Eastern Melanesia. I'm an anthropologist, and I'd like to bring up something that's on behalf of the traditionally orientated communities, particularly in Vanuatu. Some of these questions have been brought up. Some of the ideas that you've put forward, the panelists, is excellent, really good. There's a couple of things, though, that I think people in many parts of the world need to realize is that there are communities that actually don't want anything to do with the modern world. As the modern world is basically seen as the institution. Basically, in pidgin English, it's called all white men, the white people, are the ones that have been responsible for trying to steal their land, kill them off, steal their religion, steal their women, and everything. And it's looked upon that the modern financial crisis, that's the fault of the white man. The ones who are not suffering are the ones who are in the traditional societies, the kind that I'm speaking about. None of them are in debt. Climate change, they look upon climate change, sea level rise, and things like that as the fault of the white man. But many of these societies are still being faced with intense pressure from the modern world to try and change. So I really do think there's some really serious thought that needs to be put in. What do you mean by development? What does the modern world mean by development? It's not a question of making everybody get more money. Sometimes money is the problem. And for some of these societies in certain areas of Vanuatu who've decided to purposely opt out of the modern world, you need to redefine what you mean by development. Development should not be about money, about giving more people access to money. Development should be about giving a better quality of life. Electricity is actually not an essential of life, it's a luxury. Many of these cultures who've decided to opt out of the modern world, they have their own forms of lighting. But you, the presenters, have put forward some excellent ideas about those groups that need a little bit of energy for this and a little bit of energy for that. But if you go into some of the more isolated traditional villages in certain of the outer islands in Vanuatu and sort of say, oh, the white man's world says, now you're not allowed to burn wood anymore for fire, they're going to think everybody is absolutely crazy. Basically, the onus is, as you were saying, very well said, the onus is on the modern so-called developed, in inverted commas, world to change, get their act together, as you've very rightly said. And if people want to continue living their traditional, completely self-sufficient and sustainable lifestyles, let them do it, away from modern money and away from the things that we all think are essentials, but they're mostly just luxuries.
Thank you very much for that, Kirk. I'll pass that one to you, Tendai, and sort of expand on it a little bit. In your work at the World Bank, have you noticed any resistance in villages, in communities to providing energy? And also, I'll broaden it slightly and ask how much governmental support do you get in countries like Tonga? Is the government very keen to ease the cost burden on its people by providing cheaper and more renewable, sustainable energy?
Yes, okay. In terms of the countries themselves, people everywhere use a lot of energy, whether, as the man said, it could be for traditional fuels, such as firewood, but in some countries that as the population grows and the sustainability of using firewood resources actually diminishes, and in some countries they will use the logs for export or as well. So that's what we're talking about here. Is I don't necessarily agree that electricity is a essential service. I think energy is an essential sort of thing that people use in their lives for cooking, and that's what we're talking about. Jack mentioned LP gas as an alternative way. So we're really looking at ways of providing energy services which all communities use in one way or another, and doing that at lower cost, higher safety. In terms of, are the governments in these countries interested? Very much so. In Vanuatu and in Tonga, the government is very keen to increase the access of people to modern energy services that are safe, reliable, lower cost than the services they're using at the moment. And certainly in Tonga, the government is very keen to have an overall sort of energy sector roadmap or master plan in place.
Mark, yes.
Could I just add a little, because I think you've raised a very important issue. I mean, it's true that a number of societies in the Pacific area have been sustainable for thousands of years. Even in Papua New Guinea, some of the so-called slash and burn societies were sustainable. We have archaeological evidence going back 10,000 years. And then our lot came along and got them to plant cash crops and change their economy and undermine that. And it is fantastic if a community gets together and says, we will stand against the outside pressures and maintain our traditional lifestyle. I don't know what's happening in Vanuatu, but I'm aware that in the Solomons, the logging companies come in, not just the white man's logging companies, but from all over, from China and other countries, and they basically offer villagers money to remove their forests, and it splits the villages, as I'm sure you're aware. They offer free shares to members of parliaments and so on. And so that what I'm saying is there are enormous pressures on the village communities, and those few that can stick to their traditional lifestyle have done a fantastic job. But for the majority who really can't, there is an option with village level energy and village level development. And a PACE group that I used to be associated with worked in partnership with village communities in the Solomon Islands, and they helped villages to install micro hydro plants, generated a small amount of electricity, allowed them to set up small local sustainable local businesses, and basically stand independent of the pressures on their neighbouring villages that were basically levelling the forests all around that were so essential to their futures. So I think it is important that village people are offered the opportunity to have energy independence, not to be tied to some centralised system, but to have independence and to have some resources to stand up in the world of pressure from the outside.
As Mark says, it is possible to, I think, be sensitive to the needs and to the ambitions of traditional communities in many of these countries. And I think it's also important to recognise, as I think you mentioned, that many of these communities actually prefer to stay outside the cash economy, for instance. And I think last week in Tonga, we heard of some marvellous examples of projects that are being developed whereby, yes, they may be able to be offered a more efficient, a cleaner technology like solar, for instance, for simple lighting. But the payment terms for that, there are schemes operating now where it's not cash for crop, but energy for crop, whereby they bring their crops or their produce to a marketplace, and that a proportion of that is directly diverted through back into the financing institution in order to be able to pay for the installation of some of those technologies. Now, these are technologies, and these are energy options that the communities themselves are requesting, that they're asking for. So I think what we need to do is to identify what is the demand and then see whether we can find a harmonisation of the objectives of both the development community and the traditional communities that are operating in those areas.
Mark, I'd like to return to a point that you made earlier in which you called carbon capture and storage, you refer to it as mythical. And I was just wondering whether you can expand on that a little bit, particularly in the context of the fact that so many Western nations, so many developed nations are putting an awful lot of money and time and resources into it. Australia is a prime example. Over in the UK, they've just announced new plans to store a lot of carbon under the deep under the North Sea. So why do you think it's mythical? Why that scepticism?
Australia's already committed almost $2 billion, both at the federal and state level, to carbon capture and storage. It's a technologically unproven system. Bits of it have been proven, but as a system, it's a long way off. With so much money being poured in, there's no doubt that we will see some pilot plants up and running in the next 10 years around the world, and there's already a number under development. But even the United States, under the previous Bush government, discontinued their prime project under the US Department of Energy, the FutureGen project, which was a about $1.6 billion US project to build a coal-fired power station with capture and sequestration of the carbon dioxide. And they discontinued it on the basis of rapidly escalating costs. So this is a very complex system, technologically speaking. Several pathways have been suggested. Capturing the carbon dioxide from the chimneys, the coal-fired power stations, which looks like being very difficult indeed, or creating a new kind of coal-fired power station that converts the coal into gas and separating the carbon dioxide from the gas, which in theory is easier. But all these things are going to take a lot of time. I personally hope that we will see carbon capture and sequestration available sometime in the 2020s, maybe 2025 on a commercial scale. We desperately need it, along with renewable energy sources. But the reality is it's not going to happen soon. And I am concerned that countries, as you're saying, Ian, are putting in these huge resources. And in a situation where there are limited economic resources, that means renewable energy sources and energy efficiency, which work and which are available now in many cases, are not being funded. So we have a situation in Australia where Australia used to be one of the world leaders in solar power, and we still have excellent groups, dare I say it, at University of New South Wales and at the Australian National University. But we have lost some of our best people overseas. Our world-leading expert on solar thermal power, Dr. David Mills, has gone to California, and luckily he has an IT billionaire to support him in the new company Osra. But other companies have folded, and BP Solar has left its manufacturing plant is gone. It's closed down in the last few weeks. And really, there should be more resources going towards genuinely clean, secure power, which is available now. And in the short term, the main sources for electricity that are available now on a large scale are wind power, which has been growing at a phenomenal rate in some countries, and bioenergy, which is energy from the residues of existing crops, so it doesn't take up additional land. And Australia has enormous amount of bioenergy potential. And while these technologies start to maybe produce a large percentage of our electricity, we can be rapidly upscaling the solar technologies, which we all acknowledge are more expensive and need further development now, but they work. The issue is not whether they work, the issue is to bring down their cost, to find out which versions of those technologies are the best, because with solar thermal power we now have about 8 or 10 different systems being offered. They all work. We have about 6 different systems for storing the energy overnight in heat, which is much cheaper than battery storage, so it has potential for baseload power, but we'll need a few years to shake out the technologies and find the best. All these technologies, given the right support from government, will be available long before carbon capture and sequestration is available on a commercial scale.
Okay, lovely. We've got time for one more question, please, from the floor.
This is a very interesting talk because I've been interested for a long time as an ex-physics teacher, and I've got a brother involved, and I had relatives in England involved with water energy there and nuclear energy, and my brother's in renewable energy in South Australia. And so I think we've got to look at it. Where are the sources of energy? Well, the main one is the sun. There's another one is the earth, with the earth's heat. But from the sun we also get the bioenergy. And then there's nuclear energy, which I think is we now know that it's more dangerous than it's worth. And there's gravity. So that's where your energy is, from the earth and the sun. And therefore you have to look then at why you need energy. Well, when I was young, we used horses. We didn't have cars. I'm very old, so that we had horses. We had dirt roads, and they did all the work. We used kerosene up in the country. In Perth we did have electricity, but in the country they didn't. And so I know what it was like living in the country. You used kerosene lamps, and we didn't even have torches in those days, just kerosene lamps. And everything went very well. Of course, we didn't have radio or anything like that either. We didn't have clocks. We had ordinary clocks, but you had to set them by the sun. So you had your little book to look at the sunset and work out whether your clock was fast or slow, and so on. So I've seen all this coming. So what has been the problem? I think the main problem is the increase in the number of population, that actually the world is overpopulated, and therefore we're busily using up all our resources. There'll be a time when it comes to the end. Now, I don't know if you've read Dawkins' a book on collapse and why societies collapse. I got 3/4 of the way around, and it was so depressing that I had to give it up. But the way we're going now, with the population explosion all around the world and the use up of all our natural resources, there's something serious other than just not the global warming. That can be one way or another as far as global warming is concerned. Being into meteorology and all that type of thing, it comes and goes.
We have to stop you there because we're about to run out of tape. But very quickly, guys, why do we need energy? Why do these countries need energy?
There we are. I think I've said enough.
Just a quick one-sentence answer.
Okay. Countries need energy to provide basic services for their population, whether that be education, healthcare. No, I mic'd up. Education, healthcare, but it also generates job opportunity. It helps business activities. In terms of the sources of energy, there's a range of those, and most countries like to have a diverse range of sources. But it facilitates economic growth. It facilitates human service delivery, and it can often do that at a lower cost and increase safety over alternative sources that are there, or traditional sources.
Thank you. Jack, very quickly.
I think the question is right in the sense that population growth is projected to increase from 6 to 9 billion before it starts coming down again. And so I think the reality of the situation is that there are a lot more people on the planet who are going to be increasingly demanding the sorts of energy or the sorts of living standards that energy provides that is enjoyed by a relatively small proportion of the population. And that's an issue that needs to be addressed, and that's really the reason why we're focusing on energy as such a fundamental requisite in terms of trying to achieve the Millennium Development Goals, having understood that what you've said about population growth is undeniable.
And Mark, finally.
Well, simply to say that there are really three drivers of environmental impact, and they are population, they are consumption per person, and they are the choice of technologies we make. And I believe we have to address all three. We've tended to focus on technology, and that's been my fault, partly, for my own work. But we do have to address population growth, particularly in countries like Australia, where every additional Australian has more greenhouse gas emissions than almost an additional person almost anywhere else in the world. And we really have to look at our economic system and try to move it towards a steady state system. I mean, we are wasting a lot of energy, a lot of materials, and a lot of land. And well, we don't need growth ultimately in the rich countries, I believe, in energy, materials, or land. But in some of the developing countries, I think they do need growth in energy use and possibly materials use. So we have to contract and converge with the overdeveloped countries becoming far more efficient, and so allowing more space, more ecological space for the developing countries. So we all converge to a level that is sustainable for this planet.
That's great. Thank you, Mark. There's been some very interesting points made from our panellists, who have been Tendai Gregan, Jack Whelan and Mark Diesendorf, and also some very interesting points from our audience here this afternoon. Thank you very much for coming. You can watch this Praxis Roundtable and indeed any of the three previous ones at www.worldbank.org/PI or at www.the-diplomat.com. The next issue of The Diplomat is out at the beginning of May, so I urge you all to buy that, and Praxis will return next month. Thank you very much. Thanks, guys.